gaining profound significance in the modern industrial age, the paradoxical concept of the manufacture of consent in a democratic society was viewed by those in power as the primary tool to be used in organizing and shaping industrial capitalist democracy. In a society supposedly predicated on democratic power that flowed from the minds of the free masses, those in elite positions of authority sought to ensure that those they viewed as incompetent to think for themselves, the common people, were led to make the correct decisions regarding the social, political, and economic nature of society. In essence, the mind of the herd had to be understood so that it could be properly manipulated. The way to understand the mind was to understand its impulses. This meant understanding and utilizing sexual impulse as a tool to manipulate the individual and serve as a base to construct an understanding of the self and society. The principle of the manufacturing of consent via psychological manipulation became the cornerstone for modern advertising in the 20th century. However, as historians often illustrate, the common person is rarely a passive observer and often utilizes the dynamics of the time in which he or she lives to negotiate his or her interests with those in positions of authority. It is this negotiation between elite, hegemonic social framers and socially aware masses that serve as a backdrop for historical research that seeks to understand commodity fetishism, human sexuality, and the dynamics of historical agency. This essay will analyze how historians and academics have understood the sexual nature of commodity fetishism in commercial culture via the lens of modern U.S. history. The works to be surveyed include Stuart Ewan's PR, A Social History of Spin, Tom Reichert's The Erotic History of Advertising, Elizabeth Cohen's A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, Catherine Perkins' Food is Love, Advertising and Gender Roles in Modern America, Jill Field's An Intimate Affair, Women, Lingerie and Sexuality, James Peterson's The Century of Sex, Playboy's History of the Sexual Revolution, 1900 to 99, and Carolyn Kitch's The Girl on the Magazine Cover, The Origins of Visual Stereotypes in American Mass Media. In addition to the aforementioned monographs, academic articles such as Joanne Meyerowitz's Women, Cheesecake, and Borderline Material, Responses to Girly Pictures in the Mid-20th Century United States, Reichert and Carpenter's study, An Update on Sex and Magazine Advertising, 1983-2003, and Peter Lith's Think of Her as Your Mother, Airline Advertising and the Stewardess in America, 1930-1980, will be surveyed in order to provide further illumination on how the topics of sex, commodity fetishism, and social control are intertwined. Despite the relatively wide array of cross-disciplinary scholarship on the topic of sex, advertising, and commodity fetishism, scholars are generally in agreement about the role industrialization and urbanization played as a catalyst for commodity fetishism in advertising and culture. Furthermore, historians agree that the popular magazines served as the primary mode of communication used by advertisers and public relations officials who sought to inculcate desired attitudes and thoughts among the masses via sexual mystification of commodities. The degree of emphasis on top-down versus bottom-up historical narratives varies by scholar. For example, an intellectual historian like Stuart Ewan has much less to say about subaltern negotiations of gender representation than a feminist scholar like Jill Fields. However, there is across-the-board consensus that the female body is often a mystified, sexually charged focal point that is utilized by advertisers to communicate desired attitudes about sex, gender, and consumption. The historians mentioned in this essay often acknowledge their indebtedness to critical cultural theorists in the acknowledgement sections of their monographs. The name that occurs most frequently is early to mid-20th century Italian communist theorist Antonio Gramsci, whose cultural hegemony theory emphasized how elite power centers utilize culture and psychology to shape the contours of popular logic in order to maintain political control. Cross-disciplinary anarchist intellectual Michel Foucault is also often mentioned due to his ideas concerning the hidden structures of power, hegemony, and resistance in modern society. By surveying the scholarship on the relationship between sex and commodity fetishism, one finds an analytical description of the nature of social control and the struggle to define sexuality and human freedom. Most historical scholarship on the topic of the relationship between sex and commodity fetishism is fairly recent. The works surveyed in this essay range from the late 1990s to the first decade of the 2000s. However, one of the pioneers in the historical study of the public relations industry, Stuart Ewan, began his scholarship on public relations with his 1983 monograph, Captains of Consciousness. Ewan's work has been highly influential to those seeking to understand the intellectual nature of hegemonic power structures in the modern United States. World-renowned linguist and political dissident Noam Chomsky has utilized Ewan's scholarship in his book, Deterring Democracy, which studies the coercive nature of U.S. geopolitical and domestic power. Documentarians such as PBS's Bill Moyer and the BBC's Adam Curtis have also utilized Ewan's research as a basis for their award-winning documentaries The Public Mind and The Century of the Self. Ewan's 1998 monograph, PR, A Social History of the Public Relations, encapsulates Ewan's scholarship on the nature of public relations, its psychosexual base, and its central figures. Despite the term social history in the title, PR is an intellectual history largely told from a top-down perspective that analyzes the intellectual methodologies and motivations behind the manufacturing of consent. Ewan's use of public relations manuals, the writings of capitalist socio-political theorists, and interviews with public relations officials give his monograph insight into the intellectual foundations of thought control and commodity fetishism. In part, A Social History of the Public Relations, Ewan surveys the development of the public relations industry from the late 19th to mid-20th century. In his study, Ewing focuses heavily on Edward Bernays, the godfather of modern public relations, and the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays' mother was Freud's sister, and his father was Freud's brother-in-law. Bernays is shown to be emblematic of the nature of public relations, as well as a crucial figure in articulating the concepts and methodologies of the manufacture of consent as a mode of social control in a democratic society. Ewan illustrates how Bernays utilized his uncle's theories of group susceptibility to the power of suggestion and the primitive subconscious sexual impulse as a catalyst for human behavior. These comprise the foundation upon which to craft corporate propaganda and maintain social stability in the face of potentially fascistic or communistic mass impulse. According to Freud, the group provided the individual with a standard by which to measure and guide his actions and thoughts. For Bernays, if one could manipulate the actions of the group via sexual impulse, then one could manipulate the individual who looks to the group as an example for proper conduct. In his public relations guidebook Propaganda, Bernays explains his methodology. According to Bernays, the group mind does not think. It acts on impulse, habits, emotion. Its first impulse is to follow the example of a trusted leader. Sex, gregariousness, the desire to lead, the maternal and paternal instinct are all dominating desires to the group. Bernays goes on to say, these desires are sound mechanisms upon which a public relations expert can base his selling arguments to bring about identification by utilizing the appeals to desires and instincts. Bernays would go on to utilize these ideas in his advertising campaign for Lucky Strike cigarettes, which he marketed to women as both phallic symbols and patriotic torches of freedom. Ewan illustrates how Bernays utilized these ideas to serve what he viewed as a progressive attitude towards educating the public on venereal disease. The eugenically titled turn-of-the-century play, Damaged Goods, told a cautionary tale about a syphilitic man who sired a syphilitic son, an action which resulted in tragedy. During his stint as editor at the medical magazine Medical Review of Reviews, Bernays sought to promote the play as a modern educational tool to combat venereal disease. However, in order to avoid mass-based conservative backlash against a play concerning venereal disease, Bernays constructed the front organization called the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund Committee to promote the play. To add credibility to the committee, Bernays was able to get reputable members of New York's political and financial elite to endorse the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund Committee. Bernays' application of his ideas concerning the emphasis of sexually charged content and utilization of leadership figures to shape and guide mass opinion led to Damaged Goods not only being shown in New York City, but also to its receiving glowing press reviews, especially in women's magazines. In particular, Ladies' Home Journal described the play as a hopeful and significant event. The relevance of Freudian psychoanalysis and commodity fetishism are further explored in Peter Lith's article, Think of Her as Your Mother, Airline Advertising and the Stewardess in America, 1930 to 1980. Lith focuses on the utilization of airline stewardesses as symbols for female sexuality and motherhood, which were in turn projected onto major commercial airlines. Freudian ideas concerning the Oedipus complex were evoked by advertisers when male consumers were presented with American Airlines 1968 magazine ads featuring suggestively posed stewardesses, accompanied by the tagline, Think of her as your mother. Advertisers sought to manipulate supposed psychosexual subconscious impulses via an objectified amalgamation of mother, lover, and the giant steel phallic symbol of the plane. The sexual fetishization of the airplane ads was further developed by the 1970s. Lith references the 1971 Fly Me campaign in which National Airlines ads were predicated on overt sexual innuendo. Such ads included stewardesses proclaiming, I'm a girl, I'm an airplane, I'm an airline, I'm a fresh new way of getting you where you need to go, and the slogan, I'm going to fly you like you've never been flown before. Like Ewan's and Lith's work, James Peterson's The Century of Sex analyzes sex and commodity fetishism from a top-down perspective. Commissioned and influenced by the editorial perspectives of Hugh Hefner, The Century of Sex, Playboy's History of the Sexual Revolution, 1909, tells the story of sex, sexuality, and sexual objectification from the vantage point of Playboy magazine. According to Peterson, liberation of sexual desire is a primary mode of historical progress, and Playboy magazine, in particular, represented an embodiment of progressive sexual liberation through its images of beautiful, artistically presented, sexually uninhibited nude women. As the 20th century closed, Playboy founder Hugh Hefner wanted Playboy to release a historical monograph dealing with the history of sex in the 20th century U.S. The resulting book portrays the triumph of sexual liberation over the forces of sexually repressive historical agents, ranging from individuals such as Jerry Falwell on the evangelical right to Andrea Dworkin on the feminist left. Author James Peterson describes the book as a biography of sex that reflects Hugh Hefner's desire to focus on the tension between sexual liberation and repression. Like other scholarship on the topic of sex and commodity fetishism, in this case Playboy bunnies serving as positive examples of fetishization, though the term is not used by Peterson, The Century of Sex views the rise of sexuality in U.S. mainstream culture as stemming from industrialization and urbanization of the late 19th and early 20th century. The strength of The Century of Sex lies in its organization and rich primary source material. The monograph is organized in 10 chapters, one for each decade of the 20th century. Within each chapter, Peterson utilizes a wide variety of primary sources, ranging from popular magazines, newspaper articles, intellectual opinion, sexual literature, and art, as well as popular and pornographic motion pictures. Peterson focuses on the importance of industrialization, technology, jazz culture, nightclubs, patriotism, dissent, and conservative hypocrisy. Each chapter is accompanied by a 3-5-page timeline surveying the important current events of each decade. While The Century of Sex is thoroughly researched, it is also highly subjective. Its enthusiastic portrayal of Playboy magazine as a progressive force in the battle for sexual liberation betrays a not historically unfounded, but clearly self-flattering editorial bias. Furthermore, Peterson's painting of the pro-life movement as a group of religious zealots who engage in or sympathize with the bombing of abortion clinics is highly reductionist and misrepresents nonviolent opponents of abortion. Peterson's characterization of the 1980s as a time of regressive moral rigidity has also been challenged by the scholarship of Tom Reichert, who utilizes statistical analysis to chart the rapid escalation of sexual content in the print media from 1983-1990. Continuing with the theme of a fetishization and the contested significance of Playboy and other borderline magazines, Joanne Meyrowitz's article, Women, Cheesecake, and Borderline Material, Responses to Girly Pictures in the Mid-20th Century United States, reveals that feminist debate over the positive or negative significance of erotic female images in the media dates back to the late 19th century and continues to this day. As modern advertising began with the advent of industrialization, the female body became an erotic, emotionally potent symbol which projected sexual significance onto otherwise bland consumer products and magazines. These portrayals began with mass-produced depictions of Victorian female nudes on commodities and evolved into mid-20th century cheesecake magazines, featuring photos of scantily clad women who were simultaneously sexual and wholesome. Feminists who sought to free themselves from the sexual constraints of Victorian patriarchal conceptions of femininity celebrated these images as positive portrayals of female beauty that provoked healthy male interest in the newly liberated female form. However, conservative-minded feminists viewed these images as exploitative objectifications of the female body. The issue over what was considered healthy interest in female cheesecake and abnormal fixation with pornographic imagery intensified as tensions between liberal and conservative feminists were compounded with the advent of Playboy, which featured completely nude models. Meyerowitz offers no closure on this debate. She sees it as ongoing, with pro- and anti-sex feminists of the late 20th to early 21st century continuing to debate the significance of the exposed female body, the nature of patriarchy, and the tools women use to achieve socio-historical agency. Carolyn Kitsch's monograph, The Girl on the Magazine Cover, The Origins of Visual Stereotypes in American Mass Media, utilizes early 20th century magazine content to demonstrate that the challenges that feminism's second wave faced were continuations of the same challenges faced by feminism's first wave during the early 20th century. Kitsch illustrates this point by analyzing the content of turn-of-the-century women's magazine covers. According to Kitsch, the covers reflect the first-wave feminist struggle to define female identity due to the broad, undefined nature of feminism. The question was grappled with in a 1914 issue of Good Housekeeping. The closest feminism could come to consolidating a core concept was its intellectualization of the female desire to overcome dissatisfaction and alienation, which in turn often led to political activism. First-wave feminist activism helped give women the right to vote and sensitize the population to the issues of inequality. However, the degree of participation in patriarchal norms and a unified political agenda for the first wave remained elusive. These issues confronted feminism's second wave as well. For example, women in the 20s and 70s were unsure to what extent they should maintain a traditional manner of feminine dress or embrace a more masculine aesthetic in dress. In the first wave's case, the 1920s flapper. If a woman did embrace a more masculine aesthetic in her dress, did this represent her liberating herself from male bondage? Or was she simply mimicking the dress of her oppressor? These dilemmas were never resolved and were reflected on the covers of periodicals such as Life magazine. While Stuart Ewan's work emphasizes the importance of the intellectual origins of commodity fetishism, and James Peterson and Carolyn Kitch survey the socio-political significance of magazine covers, Tom Reichert's The Erotic History of Advertising focuses on the erotic nature of advertising content. Reichert's work is an overview of sex in advertising that attempts to gauge the effectiveness of various ad campaigns that use sexual imagery to intertwine a consumer's impulse for sex with the consumer's impulse for material consumption. He utilizes an immense volume of advertisements from men's and women's leisure magazines to argue that there has always been a strong hedonistic current within American capitalism. Since the late 1800s, as Reichert attests, advertisers have used sexual imagery involving the female body 90% of the time to cultivate a sexual response on the part of the consumer in order to increase consumption of leisure items. Reichert presents ads as far back as the 1870s featuring semi-erotic paintings of female nudes to sell tobacco products. Other items range from toothpaste to soda, coffee, jeans, and condoms. Thus, any commodity can be sexualized to cultivate a physical and psychological attraction to a product. Reichert's interest is in how advertisers are able to use sexualized commodity advertisements in a way that will entice but not offend the potential consumer. This is done by utilizing cultural zeitgeist as a conduit for sexualizing commodities. For example, the Victorian pretense of the classical female nude was used in the 1800s to sell tobacco to men, while in the early mid-20th century, Rockwell-esque illustrations of sensual yet wholesome women were used to sell calendars to men in what Reichert sees as a forerunner to the Sports Illustrated swimsuit calendars. While Reichert sees the presence of sex in advertising as being a consistent feature of industrial capitalist society, he is also interested in the extent to which sexual content in advertising has become more intense over time, and what motivates advertisers to increase that intensity. In his article written with Courtney Carpenter, An Update on Sex in Magazine Advertising, 1983-2003, Reichert charts a steady rise in the intensity of sexual content in men's and women's magazines from 1983 to 2003. However, the rapidity of this increase was greatest during the decade of 1983-1990. This shows a highly sexualized dimension of a decade that is viewed by scholars such as Playboy historian James Peterson as sexually conservative. On the theme of erotic imagery, Reichert and Carpenter trace the rise of sexual content in the 80s advertisers being aware of the habituation effect, a term derived from a desensitization that occurs among consumers of pornography who need more intense sexual imagery to elicit a desired physiological response. In the case of the advertisers, they are seeking a more intense psychological response on the part of the consumer. However, Reichert and Carpenter see a plateauing of intensity of sexual imagery involving men and heterosexual couples in magazines in the late 90s to early 2000s, which they trace to the intensity of conservative watchdog groups and the sobering effect of the September 11th terrorist attacks. However, while Reichert and Carpenter see a leveling off of sexual portrayals of men and couples, they see an exponential rise in the intensity of the sexualized portrayal of women during the late 90s, early 2000s. In addition to the possibility of advertisers compensating for potential loss in profit by increasing the intensity of female sexual imagery, Reichert and Carpenter link increased female sexualization to the success of Maxim magazine. This publication has pushed other magazines aimed at young men to stay competitive with Maxim by mimicking its editorial policy of portraying unapologetically blatant sexual images of women. To substantiate their claims, Reichert and Carpenter rely heavily on statistical data and other secondary studies dealing with sex and advertising. While Ewan, Peterson, and Reichert emphasize the power of the impulse to fixate on sex, Catherine Parkin adds an extra biological dimension to the mystification of commercial content. In her monograph, Food is Love: Advertising Roles in Modern America, Parkin analyzes advertisers' merging of the desire to eat, have sex, and consume commercialized food products in 20th century advertisements. Parkin surveys the content of women's magazines and advertising studies stemming from historical, sociological, and communications-based disciplines. However, Parkin's use of interviews with advertising executives provides the reader with immense topical insight into her topic. Ad agency president David Ogilvy is quoted as saying, "There really isn't any difference between the various brands of whiskey or the various brands of beer. They are all about the same. So are the cake mixes and the detergents and the automobiles." When selling products to women, advertisers solve this dilemma by cultivating irrational brand loyalty by playing on a woman's sense of duty to her family, desire for nourishment, sexual impulses, and insecurities. In short, a woman was told to convey her love to her country and family by purchasing certain types of food. For example, Green Giant ran an ad campaign that portrayed their sweet peas as an embodiment of a wife's desire to feed her husband. This process can become more extreme as the food brand itself is portrayed as a wholesome, attractive, caregiving female. Such was the case with Betty Crocker. Parkin views this paradigm as continuing into 21st century advertisements, an occurrence which she laments as the continuation of unrealistic and sexist portrayals of male and female gender roles. Parkin's emphasis on the dutiful female consumer is also covered in Liz Cohen's award-winning monograph, A Consumer's Republic, which focuses on the merger of post-war patriotism with mass consumption. While Cohen does not devote her monograph to viewing food products as symbols for a woman's role as a housewife, nurturing mother, and lover to her husband, she, like Parkin, analyzes how women were instructed, via advertisements, to fulfill their duty as constructive members of society by buying the proper types of goods that would aid them in nourishing their children, keeping a clean home, and keeping their husbands sexually fulfilled. In her monograph, An Intimate Affair, Women, Lingerie, and Sexuality, Jill Fields views underwear as a symbol for both female subjugation to capitalist patriarchy and as a symbol for female socio-sexual negotiation and liberation. For Fields, as the negotiation for female sexual liberation developed, the same piece of underwear could have completely different socio-political significance. For example, during the Victorian era, crotchless underwear for women was considered a sign of a woman's conservative femininity. Any type of garment resembling pants risked blurring gender roles. However, as the 20th century progressed, women demanded more freedom, and industrialization and urbanization made society more sexualized. Crotchless underwear in the 20th century meant easy access to intercourse. The ambiguous significance of women's underwear continues today. For example, the thong can serve both the conservative function of concealing a panty line or be a hypersexual signifier for the female torso. The meaning is based on the woman's attitude and the external social context, determined by the male and female struggle to define femininity, drawing on Gramscian Marxist analysis. Fields also discusses the role that sexual fetishization of underwear plays in obscuring highly exploitative and sometimes miserable working conditions in garment factories and sweatshops. However, the exploitative conditions in which underwear is assembled can also serve as a catalyst for working-class revolts, resulting in strikes, rising of class consciousness, better working conditions, and increased public awareness of working-class abuse. Fields ends her monograph by stating, "The contradictions persist as feminists seek greater joys and pleasures by striving to understand, contest, and transcend the appeal of feminized material culture and its power to bind women in many ways." As scholarship on the topic of commodity fetishism and the objectification of the body continues, scholars will undoubtedly look at new forms of advertising and media entertainment to study and intemperate. Scholars and historians will likely find a rich opportunity for socio-historical insight if they direct their attention at forms of media entertainment such as professional wrestling aimed at young working-class men. For example, the objectification of the male and female body and the commodity character of professional wrestlers' labor could be analyzed and interoperated by historians interested in the fields of labor and sexuality. In doing so, historians could find a new avenue to find deep meaning in the seemingly benign. Sex advertising and commodity fetishism lie at the core of American capitalist culture. The above-mentioned scholars have illustrated how commodity fetishism is utilized by economic interests to manipulate the public mind and sculpt society in order to sell products and earn profits. In doing so, these interests frame the terms of negotiation and struggle between the classes and even genders. Very frequently, the tool implemented to achieve profit-motivated goals is what many see as the exploitation of the female body. Instead, some women derive a sense of agency in choosing to be part of this process. However, while there is an oppressive, manipulative dimension to capitalist consumer culture, there also lies within it the potential for the positive elements of capitalism, material abundance, vivid consumer art, and formal functions of democracy to be utilized as the means to create a better future. In order for these positive goals to be achieved without the exploitation of objectified women, who are used as merely the means to an end, a major shift in advertising approaches would have to occur. The content of the work of the scholars discussed above, while limited by academic bias and/or partial understanding, is able not only to give their readers insight into the past, but also to provide insight into the complexities of present society and confront current and future forms of hegemonic injustice. Bibliography: Chomsky, Noam, and Edward Herman. Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media. New York, Pantheon Books. 1988. Cohen, Liz. A Consumer's Republic: The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America. New York, Alfred A. Knopf. 2003. Ewan, Stewart. Per A Social History of the Public Relations. Basic Books, 1998. Fields, Jill. An Intimate Affair: Women, Lingerie, and Sexuality. Berkeley, University of California Press, 2007. Kitsch, Carolyn. The Girl on the Magazine Cover: The Origins of Visual Stereotypes in American Mass Media. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 2001. Meyerowitz, Joanne. Women, Cheesecake, and Borderline Material: Responses to Girly Pictures in the Mid-20th Century United States. Eddie Kennedy. Kathleen. Ullman, Sharon, Sexual Borderlands. Constructing an American Sexual Past. Ohio State University Press. Columbus, 2003, 320-337. Parkin, Catherine J. Food is Love: Advertising and Gender Roles in Modern America. Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2006. Peterson, James R. The Century of Sex: Playboy's History of the Sexual Revolution, 1999. Grove Press, New York, 1999. Reichert, Tom, and Carpenter, Courtney. An Update on Sex and Magazine Advertising, 1983-2003. Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, 81-4, 2004, 823-837. Reichert, Tom. The Erotic History of Advertising. Amherst, New York. Prometheus Books, 2003. Leith, Peter. Think of Her as Your Mother. Airline Advertising and the Stewardess in America, 1930-1980. Journal of Transport History, 31, 2009, 121.